Welcome in, everyone. Welcome to the Buddhist Wisdom Podcast. And again, I have my friend Deborah Eden Tull here with me, Dharma teacher, author, spiritual activist, all around badass, if I can say that, if that's okay, all around amazing teacher. So welcome back. Welcome back, Eden. Yeah, it's great to have you here.
Scott, I'm grateful to be here with you. We had such a deep, dropped-in, fascinating conversation last time, and I love the topic that we're touching today.
Yeah, and just to say a little bit about that, Eden and I, we have many topics we want to talk about, but we chose to talk about Eros and how Eros relates to our spiritual path. So this is going to be an interesting one. So I think I've been looking forward to this for a while. So Eden, I'd love to hear, just kicking it off, what you, how do you define Eros? Just briefly, and then we can go into more depth on it.
I think first, I want to really encourage a broad definition of Eros. I always go actually back to the Greeks, for whom Eros is the creative impulse. It's canalized the existence of all of life, and it arises from the void or darkness. And just to acknowledge that we're talking about life force. To be alive is to be open, receptive, to relate, to share life. And I think it's interesting that as we deepen our practice of meditation, of Dharma, there is much more space generally for Eros to come through. Much more life force, vibrant aliveness. And yet erotic energy is really stirring. And so often it is left out of Dharma conversations or Dharma teaching. So I think this creates a really interesting field of inquiry for people. And I want to say just towards the beginning of this conversation that nothing that we'll offer today is prescriptive, just sharing an emergent conversation from our two perspectives and experience about what's helpful to consider around this topic. Yeah,
I really appreciate that introduction. And yeah, just seconding that for any listeners out there, or people watching on YouTube or another format. Just welcoming everyone and where they're at. And, already I think you already opened up for me a lot of questions, because when I Googled Eros, I didn't do like a super deep Google on it, but when I Googled it, it just basically says romantic, passionate love. It does refer to like the Greek god Eros. And there was an interesting one though, and you're starting to name it, where there was a kind of in a short paragraph they did said in the Greek interpretation, of the actual Greek word, it didn't refer to like who we're attracted to. It referred to the energy itself. And I think you were naming that as like it's much broader than just passionate love.
Yes. And, I'm speaking as someone who, spent 7.5 years as a Zen Buddhist monastic, who's experienced many different relationships, who's had periods in my life where I was less sexually active or periods where I was more, who's currently married to my beloved. And just to name that Eros has been a vital and useful inquiry through each and every one of those phases in life. That really, when we're talking about our relationship with embodiment and with life force, I think it's because life force is so stirring that we've created so many rules around Eros and around sexuality. And in this conversation, we're also navigating the complexity of all that we've inherited in terms of both really puritanical conditioning, like here in the US, to within Buddhism, a long legacy of a sex-spirit divide, seen differently through different traditions, but still needs to be named, and also quite a bit of misogyny. And I think it's important to acknowledge all of this complexity while we present this topic from the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, I appreciate that a lot. And please keep reminding, because I think bringing that in, to me, it just helps us to open our lenses around what we're actually talking about. And also to recognize, like, you and I have certain lenses we're coming from. Like, I'm a straight heterosexual male. And there's both things that I'm conditioned by, and I would say viewpoints people can condition me towards, meaning like they also see me a certain way because of that reason, right?
Yeah.
Which I think we have to acknowledge both lenses.
I'm with you, absolutely. And I always identified as bisexual, and I'm married to my beloved who's a man, and identify as female. And I think I'll share that one of the times in life that this topic became most interesting is when I was in the transition from living as a monastic to living out in the world again, and living in a social, relational context rather than a silent Buddhist monastery, and recognizing both the opportunity because I left the monastery to serve in a greater way. And I saw what was missing from the people I was guiding and teaching by this topic being left out. And I also happened to transition into living in the city of Los Angeles, of all places, after like silent monastery in the wilderness. And so I felt like I brought a really beginner's mind to looking out at culture and just seeing, okay, I haven't been dating for 8 years now. I've been celibate. And that was its own inquiry into relationship with the body, with sensuality, with receptivity, through the deep, profound connectedness with nature that happens when we are in chosen silence. And yet looking out at the culture and seeing so much conditioning around sexuality and relationship that felt so inauthentic for me and so deeply embedded. And so I recognize both personally for me this new phase of re-entering the domain of relationship and sexuality. That's when I wrote the book Relational Mindfulness. And also I recognized how thick the clouds of conditioning were that society seemed to be operating from. And I just found it interesting, as someone who had committed my life to practice, that I didn't see many places to look in terms of Dharma teachers or teachings to help guide me then.
Yeah.
I found that interesting and very limiting. So I feel like it's always generous when teachers presence this topic and offer guidance around this topic. And it was a really deeply rich time for me to get to distill down to, okay, folks, beyond the widely held duality, which has created both a sex-spirit divide, we could even say a body-mind divide, but also the duality of repression versus explosion. Like, I felt like I was presented with this. There's either live the life of celibacy, or repression is the way it often comes through in a puritanical lens, to explosion. You should be having as many partners as possible and learn the tantric secret to sexuality. And it just felt so dogmatic and limited. And there's a million gray areas in between, which is about each and every one of us, by letting go of conditioning and by dropping into deep inquiry of the body-mind, aligning with what is our own erotic intelligence and what is authentic. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. There's so many things in there. And, you and I are past, the line so much. We explored last time we were talking about your new book, Luminous Darkness, how we intersected with death or loss at an early age of a parent, and then our lives also intersect because we were both monastics for almost the same amount of time. I was a Buddhist monastic for 9 years, and that what you just said at the end is interesting because that's what I was thinking to share a little bit with that those extremes of repression or explosion, and I experienced those extremes very, very. I don't know if profound is the right word, profoundly, but I experienced those extremes a lot, my entire life, and as a monastic, I think this is a widely, because most people do not get to experience what we did, right? And so in a way we have a lot of, I try to remember how fortunate it was to be able to live life as a Buddhist monastic for 9 years. And I don't take it lightly. I try to also take responsibility, that I have a responsibility of whatever I was able to deepen in study and practice through that then that becomes, something I can share with others. So there's a responsibility to give back from it. So I don't see that as a selfish time. But what I've noticed, because most people don't have an experience as a celibate monastic, is a lot of people judge it that, first of all, the vows, we have many vows as a Buddhist monastic, celibacy just being one of them. And a lot, but everything kind of gets honed around that because it's, as you say, there's this element of Western society, or at least modern Western society in the United States, that hasn't come to terms with Eros, and so it continues to function in very unhealthy ways for the majority of us. And, I'd love to open that up with you in a minute as well, and kind of as we move into our conversation. But, what I noticed because of that, people were hyper-focused around celibacy, and they automatically assumed that it was a form of repression and not a form of engagement. And what I found over 9 years is, just as what you were sharing a little bit, it was more a form of engaging with Eros on a level I had never engaged with it before. Because, I often tell people this. It's like you're putting up a no sign, and that no sign or that danger sign allows a practice of mindfulness where you have to work with it. You have no choice. You either work with it or you get eaten alive by it or stop being a monastic. And so, but throughout those 9 years, I had periods of repression, and then towards the end, when I decided to return my monastic vows, there was kind of explosion in that sense because, I didn't think I was repressing, but I found out later on I was to a certain degree. But it kind of ebbed and flowed for me. I don't know about you, but I had the first 3 years were quite intense, where it was like a pot boiling, and, I was just trying to keep the lid on and not lose my monastic vows. And then after that, it became a little bit like something to work with, but I saw it in waves, where it would be kind of, these waves of intensity. And so for me, I didn't get deep enough beyond the managing phase, unfortunately. So in my monastic time, I was kind of more managing. And then towards the end, like I said, when I decided to return the vows, it was kind of more of an explosion or release, even though I went into a long-term relationship after that and moved to New York. So it's kind of we have that similar vein. You moved to LA, I moved to New York City. And so I'd love to hear for you kind of the monastic element, because I think we can start there with the dynamics of that,
Sure, yeah. And I want to also share this quote that relates. This is a quote by Almas, the founder of the Diamond Approach. Mm-hmm. And just one perspective, but he says, essence or realized self is not really embodied unless it can stay in your genitals. The deepest realization is in your genitals, he says, not in your head or in your mind. If essence doesn't stay in your genitals, it's not completely yours. That's a really packed quote. It's a really interesting perspective. But what it brings up for me, kind of in relationship to this, is just the memory of when I was a monastic, getting to be in a deep inquiry. You named it as an absolute privilege. Yes, to live that way, to live that life, about one's relationship to energy, to life force at a much more distilled level than most people living out in a world of distraction or external pulls get to experience. And I believe that today there are more and more people practicing an inquiry into their energetic system simply through an out in the world embodied meditation practice, that there's a much stronger movement of this these days, that one doesn't have to go away to a monastery or cave. There can be tremendous value. But for me, there was still a lot of actually attachment to identity of monasticism, and a little bit of confusion for some time around monasticism versus less than practice, which is less potent, some sense that it was higher on the hierarchy. And of course, there is a lot of hierarchical perception we can see within Buddhist teaching. And something happened for me, which was, well, I can share a funny story about how I integrated back into sexuality, but I had such a deep, profound connection with the natural world and with what I've always referred to as my earth body, just a sense of this body, this form, not separate from the earth, and that one of the things we're healing through this path of healing the myth of separation is our distance that's held between us and Gaia, right? Mm-hmm. When I left the monastery, that aspect of my practice opened up tenfold. And the aspect of my practice that had to do with the relational field and waking up to interbeing through relating, whether it was sexuality or kalyanamita, spiritual friendship in different forms, it became so much more potent. And it just kind of showed me, that even with the depth and the beauty of my monastic training, I had still been holding up a sort of either or mentality. Like the more profound way to practice is monasticism, and something about the relational field came second. And I see that as a danger in an age when we really have a great deal of healing to do in the relational field, and a recognition that we wake up together. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, it does. And I mean, there's a couple things that resonated with me that I wanted to share on. But, it's also interesting. I think there's a whole conversation to be had, maybe not today, about how we interpret monasticism through the modern Western lens versus how it's interpreted through Asian culture and Buddhist cultures. Like, because one thing, because I share the experience with you of, I've always struggled with relationality. And, now I know this as a type of core wound of growing up in U.S. culture. And part of it is a core wound of unlovability for a lot of us. But it's also how hyper-individualism and hyper-consumerism feeds that. So in that way, there's a larger conversation to be had at some point about that if we want to. But when I encountered Asian Buddhist monastics, and specifically Tibetan Buddhist monastics, who I became friends with sometimes, and or just happened to be around when I was in Nepal or India, there was so much relationality, and there's so much warmth, and there was so much even physical connection, not in a sexual way, but like, where nuns will hold hands when they're walking down the street, or monks. And I had monk brothers who some of them are still monks, some of them are not. In the Western world, we wouldn't even think about holding each other's hands, And that's a whole other, thing to discuss, because there's sometimes homophobic fears, underlying some of that. But I also know a lot of Western monks who are gay men and or not heterosexual necessarily, and so there's quite a few I know. So there's a whole element of discussion in that. But anyways, without going too down the rabbit hole there. So yeah, I think some of that is cultural, where I could relate to you in that, where I was alone also, because I didn't go into a monastery, I didn't go into a community, I went into a retreat. So it was, which isn't the norm. In Tibetan Buddhism, you don't become a monk or a nun to go sit alone. You become a monk or a nun to enter a monastery. So I'd often get asked, oh, by Tibetans, what monastery are you from? I'd be like, this teacher, because, that was just a question they would ask you because it's a normal question. So I think there's more we can go into there, but just briefly before we do, this part about the earth, you reminded me something which I had forgotten. I also have a very personal and rich practice of working with embodiment and embodiment in relation to the earth we live on. A lot of practices I've led for periods of time are helping to reconnect to that for myself and sometimes with others. But what a memory that arose for me is, we in Tibetan Buddhism is also complex because even as a monastic, you are still engaging with Tantric Buddhism. You're just engaging with Tantric Buddhism with celibacy. So you're still working with these energies sometimes, but within you, not with a partner or multiple partners.
Yeah.
And so, so I had this kind of internal thing. I don't know if I've ever shared this with anyone, where the earth became, to me, I just started thinking of the earth as my consort, and that sounds really weird. And I don't mean that in some physical, like expression of sexuality, but an energetic one.
Doesn't sound weird at all. Go on.
Yeah, good. And it was almost a necessity. And it deepened when I was a monk because I was alone a lot of the time in retreat, and I was alone in wilderness, like you were. And so I started exploring that relationship. And, as I'm sure we can be deeply held, by the earth. It is I don't know if I believe it's a being, though I'm not against that idea. But there's all kinds of energies and forces that are also part of our body because our body is also part of the earth, our physical body. And so I just that whole field became also part of how I worked with my own, not only general Buddhist practice, but also, what we call Vajrayana or Tantric Buddhism. I mean, we even think of the earth as one of the like 5 female wisdom bodies, or it's like a dakini, basically. We can think of it like that.
Thank you. I love the way that you frame this. And earth as consort, nothing about that seems odd to me in the least. And when we look around at the challenges we're facing today, the sobering reality we're facing through our disconnect with the earth, if more of us had in our awareness the practice of earth as consort, we would not be in this field. And so if how we treat ourselves and how we treat our world are one and the same, we recognize how vitally important it is. I believe that we open up to a much more embodied and sensuous relationship with the earth. And part of what I mean by that, when I first came to practice, I was about 19, and that was the same year that I read Joanna Macy's World as Lover, World as Self. And she's been a long time mentor and teacher of mine ever since that time. But this notion of world as lover, earth as consort, it opens us up to the inquiry into communion. And what does it actually mean to get out of our heads, to get out of our conditioned mind or thinking center as center of gravity, to move into the integrated body-mind that practice invites, right? And to really invite other forms of knowing and relating, which I consider our receptivity, our capacity to listen, to touch and be touched. When I say listening, not just auditory, but energetic and tactile listening, our sensuous intelligence and even erotic intelligence can go in that same category for me, because it is who we are to feel and express our connectedness, to commune. So I really like the word communion at this point in the conversation, and just noticing. Then here we are back in a dominant paradigm that's very much bent on the duality of repression, explosion, and all this puritanical kind of conditioning. And there's a sense of like, oh, Eros, life force, I need to block it. I need to repress it. Or the only other choice is to let it explode. Instead of really a living inquiry about how to embody it well and how to trust the opening that happens through our practice, we become more and more open, more and more attuned, more and more sensitive, that can weave in a very wise way through our erotic relating as well. Does that make sense?
Totally. Yeah. And I think this element of, I wanted to talk about it before, but maybe it's a good time to bring it up. This element of how this fits into the Buddhist path for me is, I don't know, I have lots of ways of digesting the Buddhist path, and that continues. That will probably never end. I hope it never ends, actually. And it iterates for me as a practitioner on an experiential level more and more as I work on it. But what I've noticed is sort of, for me, it's come down to, I don't mean to be overly simplistic, but a lot of it has come down to opening to more and more of my experience and reality, right? Because I can open to other people's reality through empathy and compassion, but I really can't, actually. What I can open to is mine, which may be in connection with someone else, which is fine. And then there's this depth of like intensity within that. This is the word that keeps coming to mind. And, sexual energy, at least in my experience in traditional Buddhism or Tibetan Buddhism, is it's really engaged with at a very refined stage of the path for practitioners, a more advanced stage. Yeah. And a lot of people don't understand that. But for me, I see that more as like we're working with one of the most intense energies. So we have to have this ability, or this already, I guess you could say, stage or preliminary stage of being able to be open with other kinds of energies first, including other kinds of emotional reactions, anger, other kinds of attachment that are not as intense. And then, as you're saying and pointing to so beautifully, then we have this practice, or I'm not saying we have to wait for that, right? I don't want to imply that. It can be happening all along. It's just, for me personally, it's very intense. It's the most intense energy. And the most intense energy, just like any energy that's intense for us, whether it's the most intense or not, because that's relative to the person, our habit patterns, our samsaric mind that's confused about the reality of things, it really has no choice but to suppress, repress, or engage it to get rid of it. And so in a sense, I view it all now in my practice as like a form of me not being able to handle it, and therefore I'm trying to get rid of it, And so the repression and or explosion comes into that picture. And I think, but when we really look at it, because I think it's good to be honest about it, or at least my perspective on it in this conversation, it's a very intense energy. It's like, I think it's the most intense energy we could experience as a human being. That energy. So yeah, just throwing that out there.
I'm with you. It's a very intense energy, and it's such a gift for anyone who has a practice to have a period of, for you and I, it was a period of celibacy and monasticism, or just a period or periods of more internal practice, taking a pause from that energy or from those relationships in order to deepen and distill. I find that has been incredibly valuable in my own life. And I also think that then there's a phase where people who have a practice, and you can make your own choice. It's authentic for someone to be celibate for their whole life, and for someone else to have lovers or to be in monogamous relationship. These are very personal choices. But then to have the support, and this is what I wish was offered even more within the Dharma world, the support for integration. Yeah. Because for me, and I'm someone who is recently doing some beautiful work in our Sangha around just working with fire energy, the fire element as it comes through the field of sacred activism, of our desire to bring more conscious response and healing to our world, the fire energy of recognizing anger and rage on behalf of the collective, not as a negative or a problem, but energy to meet, to be with, and also to transmute into compassionate action. I think it's important to name the fire element here, because that's one of the aspects of Eros that is so confusing for people. So I would recommend everyone who's listening to call upon some support in your practice for how to embody the fire element well, how to befriend the fire element, and how to just have a healthy living inquiry into Eros. How do I relate to this life force, this energy? How do I relate when it feels really triggering, when I'm really, really, really turned on by someone? Do I contract around that? Do I go into story around that? Can I let the energy be here and be embodied? How do I relate with the processes of Eros? Because again, one of the things practice simply offers, and I'll be really simple here too right now, is just the invitation to release, to see clearly and release so much conditioning, personal and collective, that leads to further suffering and is not useful. And there's even just a lot of conditioning around our sexual energy that keeps us from knowing deeper and more expansive connectivity, I would say.
Yeah. I can. Thank you. Yeah. And I think we have a similar view on this, which is, another way to say what I was saying is, for me, it's all a practice of training or practicing letting be with
Yes.
with experiences as they arise, whether it's a perception or a thought or a feeling or an energy or an afflictive emotion, or another person in my relationship and what's arising within me in relation to them. And, and it's a very tough one for me to sit with and let be with. Now we're talking about intense physical, erotic energy. It's a very tough one. And, but nonetheless, it gets easier. I think that's something to share with everyone too. It gets easier by learning to let be with things that aren't as intense. And then we can slowly approach that, because there's a word I want to throw out there. And I think, we'll see what we can get into, but, in a way we could say, because it's such an intense energy, it does have a danger to it, and I think this needs to be named, not in like a scary way where we need to repress it or get all puritanical, but in a way where when we're really working with that, how do we work responsibly in relation to others? And I think that's a whole other side to the conversation too. Yeah.
Yes, I'm with you. And I think that's something that I wish more and more people had support for, that I feel like, my Dharma practice has offered so much support for, is how to be with the intense energies in a way that we're not turning away from or turning towards, because that's our practice, but we're turning towards in such a way that we're really able to ground in the humility, the compassion, or at least we aspire to, the integrity to not cause harm as we're working with those energies. Does that resonate?
Totally. Yeah. And I think this is where, as I see it, kind of the stages or vehicles, in Tibetan Buddhism, they organize it into vehicles or yanas, right? Mm-hmm. Not every form of Buddhism does that. So I just want to acknowledge that. And I think I see the vehicles as really healthy forms of this, because the first vehicle, you're working more internally and you're really working with the stickiness of attachment and craving. And you're also working with, pretty disciplined outer conduct or non-harm in relation to others. And this sets up the way to work internally with oneself with these kinds of energies, which then can flow into the Mahayana, right, or the greater vehicle, and then eventually into Vajrayana or tantric practice, which unfortunately this word tantra gets interpreted into, I don't know if we want to go into this department, but a lot of tantra, it gets misinterpreted as enhancing sexual pleasure, where that's not really what we're talking about here. Of course, pleasure has to be included in the process, but we're not trying to enhance it through what we're talking about. At least I'm not sure what you feel about that, but.
Yeah, the word enhance wouldn't quite be it. There's too much manipulation and force and control connected with the word enhance, right? Or honoring life energy and celebrating life energy and working with life energy as it is. But
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. This is not sure if you want to wade into these waters, but I find this is where a lot of what's called sacred sexuality, it's a kind of a mixed bag. Yeah.
Yeah, well, let's go there for a few minutes.
Sure.
Because it's certainly an alive phrase in the field, and it might be helpful for people. And I just want to also add in, before we go there, that for me, just to emphasize, I can't really emphasize enough, like, to each their own, everyone their own choices around this. And yet I know that for me, it was so deeply freeing on my path. And it has been continually to say, where else have I not brought the power and subtlety and compassion of practice to? Where else have I not looked? Where else have I not uncovered conditioning? And so I do believe very firmly that this is a domain many people don't feel they have enough support to turn towards. And now going into your question, sometimes when we do look, where can we turn towards? We find, I think, a pretty unsatisfactory mix of capitalism and money-making schemes blended with, here's the tantric sexual secret that everyone is missing, or that kind of thing. I remember that when I was looking for support after being a monastic, I uncovered a few schools or areas of thought that just didn't point me in the direction I was hoping to go, weren't useful. Yeah. And so I think it's important to presence this. There's sacred sexuality as a living inquiry that points to direct experiences guide, and that there are, you've mentioned in Tibetan Buddhism, some incredibly rich threads, and I've certainly benefited from that. And then there's capitalism and a whole world of maybe not so useful.
Yeah, totally. And then I think there's people who are well-meaning, and yet, it takes the form of I'm forgetting the word now, but like nouveau tantra, which doesn't have a basis in lineage, more or less. And again, I'm all for people healing and figuring things out, and everyone's free to do what they want to do, but sometimes, and again, we don't have to dwell on this if you don't feel the need to, but sometimes actually things, for whatever the reason is, whether it's for consumerist capitalist ideals or power or whatever the reason is, people do. How do you say, take their own liberties to interpret what some of these ancient teachings are saying. And there is a growing body of scholars. I'm thinking of one guy, Christopher Harish, he goes by Harish, or Christopher, he's more in the Shakti and Shaivite traditions in Hindu Tantra. But he's a Sanskrit scholar, and he goes back and studies texts, on this kind of stuff, and he doesn't try to bash people for what they're doing. He's just saying that's not what these lineages were teaching and or saying. And so he goes back even to the word Kundalini. He has a lot of writing. So Christopher Wallace, I think, is his name. I'm forgetting it now. Really interesting website, and I respect his work because he's going in as a scholar, not assuming something. He's not going in with a bone to pick. He really wants to uncover what were these things really about, and especially in some of the tantric traditions that reach Tibet, they have a lot of correlation with the Shakti and some Shaivite traditions in more, I guess, the Hindu side of it. And some of these texts came out around the same time with describing how to work with, Kundalini or sexual energy specifically. And, from what I've seen, most of that is like you're working with your pot of that energy, kind of like what we're describing. You're working with that for a long time. And very little of it actually has to do with it obviously has to do with how it gets expressed, but very little of it has to do with how it gets expressed in a human sexual relationship. That's always included. But as you were pointing out in the beginning, there's so much more to how that energy gets expressed in a creative and, let's say, beneficial way in the world,
Yes, and I love that you brought that word beneficial in, because that's certainly my experience in studying not through just Buddhism, but different wisdom traditions. European shamanism has a strong influence on me as well. The connection between Eros, erotic intelligence, you brought up Kundalini energy specifically, and our capacity and willingness to allow our life force to be used in service for our world, for our collective. And that same way that energy, as we spoke of earlier, can be intense, too much for people, can have a fire element to it, makes it easy energy to turn away from. And yet, at a time when certainly our world needs us, needs the heart of service in a very direct and broad way, there is benefit from what I've witnessed to practitioners really being willing to embody Eros, to integrate Eros as their expression of creativity and service and courage and truth-telling and change-making. Yeah? So I think that's really, really important. I also just wanted to ask you if you'd speak to for a moment, because it's important what you were just saying about the difference between the deep traditions and people interpreting those traditions in ways that might seem, sexy or easy, but aren't necessarily carrying so much integrity or depth. How could people listening identify, let's say, pay attention to that? Because there's so many sources of information these days.
Yeah, I always joke that the word meditation has pretty much lost its meaning. It could really mean anything at this point. So you're right. And in a way, exploration and having a lot of avenues to explore is a good thing, because people can explore their minds, they can explore their human experience. But then, like you're bringing up, like having the discernment, that's in short supply. I find, right? Discernment is kind of, that has to grow out of our own wisdom. But people who really want to go deep, I think eventually they discover that. So I think it happens. But yeah. So thanks for that question. And I think, how to tackle this, I'll say one thing quickly, which is, I'm kind of interested in where this idea of the word tantra, which actually it means to weave. That's one definition of the word. In Tibetan Buddhism, we more think of it as continuity, but weaving continuity is kind of similar. So I'm kind of interested in where things went wonky, and I don't know, because I don't study it. Like I said, Christopher Wallace is a good guy to check out, because he does study this as a scholar. And he's also a practitioner. He's involved in a tradition. So he's a practitioner scholar, where to me that I really respect people taking that path in whatever tradition they're in. And anyways, it seems like there was a certain Western movement that started to interpret, we're talking, this is possibly, 60 to 80 years old. It's not that new. And, and then somehow, of course, and again, I don't want to demonize this, so I want to be careful here. I'm sure with kind of like our own struggles with repression in the West, then there was these things of like, how do we explore our sexuality? And then, as we were saying, it some of those, when we're engaging with something that's pleasure centered only, let's just say that pleasure is not bad, but when it's pleasure centered only and there's no deeper questions being asked, our pleasure from a Buddhist perspective, like it's not pleasure itself, it's our relationship to clinging and craving around that pleasure. And that has no end. I don't know about you. I've found that has no end, And it's just, it's a thirsty monster that keeps wanting more, right? And it leaves me less happy. That's just really the point. It's not like a religious dogma, or it has to, from my perspective, or has to be some big, edict. It's just, it's just about happiness or I should say contentment and suffering. It really comes down to that. And so we each have to explore that for ourselves. But I find these ancient traditions, going back to, I'll describe in a second more to your question, human beings have been exploring this for thousands of years. And why not rely on some of their explorations? Why do we try to invent something new that has the risk of just basically feeding our attachment more in a negative way? Where in a way, like you said, it's sort of like we have this repression and explosion. When we feed the explosion, it never ends, and we're left bereft. At least that's my experience. That's been shown to me again and again in my life, through lots of experiences, and definitely through exploration of sexuality and all that. Because this is a whole other topic. But as someone who identifies as male, and how that, how my life has been conditioned through that, there's all kinds of other stuff, shame, all kinds of other stuff that we can touch on that later if we want. But anyways, in regards to the lineages, and specifically what I work with and train in and study, the Tibetan Buddhist lineages, yeah, I think it comes down to this. It comes down to, like, are we trying to liberate our being controlled by our afflictive emotions and thoughts, and we could just say emotional reactions? Are we using something to liberate from that? Are we using something to fulfill that? Like you said it in another way. It's sort of like that is the habitual tendency. So anything that takes advantage of that, it's very obvious to me. You can just read someone's website and it's pretty obvious. Now, I'm not talking about healing here, because I think that's another topic where not everybody wants to open and to liberate. Because I don't know, from your experience, I'd like to hear this. To me, it's like, it's really, really hard. It's really hard. It takes a lot of, I don't know, willingness to go in to pain more and more, and the ability to do that.
Yes, and it's being sobered, the sacred sobering. And as you were just in your own way, so many people don't want to be sobered. They'd rather resist or stay on the surface of things. Continue. Which
I understand, and I think we need to hold that in compassion for each other, right? That element, wherever we're at. But yeah, some people, where they're at is they have some trauma, and they need to use some of these paths of sacred sexuality to heal all kinds of traumas around that. So I'm not really going to bash that. I think that's a good thing, right? Because not everybody's looking for liberation. But then when we are, then we do have to make this distinction. Are we just feeding the craving, the attachment that wants more and more and more, or wants to enhance the experience of pleasure, as we were talking about? Or are we trying to go so deep into the experience of pleasure that we cease to experience pleasure and pain as dualistic entities? This is a whole nother side of it, right? Because ultimately, I feel like, I don't know, I don't have any really deep, realization or anything like that. I'm not claiming to have any of that. I don't. I'm dedicated to practice and study and committed to that. That's really what it comes down to. But I have this theory that's, at least the Buddhist path, that's where it's leading us. That seems to be where it points to is we have to go in, and we go so far in to all of our human experience, the pain, the pleasure, everything. We don't become, but we go in. Right? There's a difference there, that we cease to contract around it. We cease to act out of selfish interest, because it's expanded so far out of that self-interest, and the self-interest can't be found anymore. And that's, it seems like that's really what it's pointing at. Yeah. Right. I'll stop there. I'll say more, but I'll give you some.
I appreciate what you're sharing. And another way, again, very simple, another helpful inquiry is, are we going into the domain of sexuality, of Eros, to dissolve the self, or to affirm the delusion of separation? As it is a phenomenal pathway for dissolving the self, if that is our intention, for waking up to interbeing, we consciousness, non-separation in such a greater way. You with me? So
Totally.
it has
Yeah.
a lot to
Beautiful.
do with intention. And, just to kind of touch on something very like a practical way people can explore this for themselves too, I might just presence, because there's so many different ways to interact with Eros. One simple way is through dance. I imagine some people listening love and have a practice of dance in their lives, and others perhaps not so much. But I have always had a love of dance, and have recognized dance as a tool for consciousness, not just something that's about either shaking out energy because I want to get away from it, or trying to get away from a feeling. I recognize dance as a really beautiful domain of the invitation to go down and into our bodies, to deeply listen, to respond in the moment, but very different from the stillness of the meditation cushion, to let movement be our portal for both connection and also for being with all that's moving through the inner landscape. Not again, shaking it out. Like sometimes I think actually in ecstatic dance, that can kind of be the approach. I'm talking more about conscious dance. But I've come to, even in certain retreats, invite people from stillness into movement, into dance, into seeing how it feels to dance together with guidance, like as meditative practice, to recognize that too, connection, relating, the intelligence of our bodies as really important domains through which we deepen our practice, rather than seeing that as separate from practice. And that can include pleasure. If we're having a story that says dualistically, pleasure versus non-pleasure, one is practice, one isn't, that's BS. Anything dualistic is. So just encouraging people to mix it up and to spend more time recognizing the vehicles of our bodies beyond through sitting meditation, walking meditation, or the other forms of, so many forms of practice, for instance, in Tibetan Buddhism, as well as Zen, but to broaden it if we want to really make our practice be something that is both resilient, that is always going deeper, and also that is awake to the opportunities of the relational field. Does that resonate with you?
Yeah, I love that. I mean, it resonates with me as like something I don't know if I envy, but I don't do that. I'm a very like sedentary person. I did at some point like to dance. I have some affinity with Latin American culture and music, because from a young age, when I was like 16, I started playing in a salsa band. But first I was listening to salsa and all kinds of different, Latin folkloric musics. And then like the only dance I ever liked was salsa dancing. And I'm not like good at it. But yeah, now I tend to. So what resonates is I think that sounds like such a wonderful way for people to work with it, because I do it in a sedentary way where I open to all my experience. But that's been something I've trained in for 10 or 15 years, and I don't think that is the most natural and or available way for a lot of people, where I think involving movement can really help. Like, and what you're saying totally makes sense. Yeah.
And this is another conversation. By the way, one thing I've recognized in our talk today is that it's kind of like a tree, where Eros has been the trunk of the tree, and there's so many different branches we could follow and explore if we wanted to. So we know we'll have more discussions. But there is certainly a movement unfolding right now within Buddha Dharma of teaching and supporting people to experience the teachings in both traditional and non-traditional ways, in ways that I would say embrace the relational field more fully as well, both a teaching tool and a domain for awakening. So I'm excited about that. And as long as that's held in integrity, that's really can be very useful and important. And I also will share just of humorous story for people that might be helpful for some listening. And I may have shared this story with you, but it was when I first visited the monastery. And I remember just having my own, like, okay, I'm going to take time to just establish my practice here in this city, this urban environment. I was waking up at like 4 a.m. to have long periods in darkness and with dawn before the city arose. And just to, I don't know about you, but it feels like when we leave the monastery, there's a process of internalizing, integrating the monastery within. Like it's a structure. There's a way in which I'm still a monk and will be until the day I die, and probably beyond. It's just becomes who you are, is the intentionality you bring to everything in life, right? But there was a day when I had kind of decided, I'm not ready for the domain of sexuality yet. That feels like a bit much. I'm still getting used to just the city, and I'm not in any hurry. And I remember asking a stranger that I met, I think getting into a conversation about dance, and they recommended a women's dance weekly gathering that happened. They didn't tell me much about it, just said it had really, really good music, and it was in walking distance from where I was staying. And so that spoke to me. And I remember showing up with my still shaved head, always bringing beginner's mind with me wherever I went, and the door opened, and the walls were painted dark red, and there were poles, and it was a pole dancing class. It was so awesome. And I remember just having a moment of, oh my, like how have I arrived here? How did I get here? The door closed behind me, and just deciding, okay, beginner's mind with everything. Like I'm not going to make any assumptions. I'm not going to feed the sex spirit divide. Like, what is this? And how did I get here? And just having a moment of watching a woman who kind of initially appeared just very homely, almost a librarian kind of a presence, just begin to move and to teach with this also incredible music playing. And I just started to fall to the ground weeping. Tears I had no idea would come, because something about recognizing the divine and true nature in this person's embodiment of erotic movement was so healing for me. And it just kind of affirmed in that moment, like, okay, the monastery is who I am wherever I go. Nothing is left out. And my job is to keep an eye out for the divine in all domains, and to certainly recognize we're unfolding lines which are illusions, which I've created from the mind of separation about what's what. Right?
Totally. Yeah. I love that story. I'm like picturing it. I'm picturing you like the shaved head nun coming in. It's so great. Yeah. And what you started to say at the end, I mean, that's very much what I've come to in my practice, is like nothing can be left out. And, for me, that sometimes feels like a charnel ground, which is the leaning into the pain area. And then what we're talking about today, like leaning into the pleasure area, or not, leaning in means learning to let be with it, not to repress or explode, right? To catalyze the energy.
Yeah.
And, I feel like this is the way. I never like to assume how a Buddhism is going to unfold in a culture, but it's kind of obvious, because the majority of us are not going to take the monastic path in Western Buddhism. And so, we need to find a way to not make a divide between what is the path and what's not the path, or to make, where holiness is on one side and the other side is dirty, which is that Puritanism. Yeah. And, I know he's a controversial figure, but for me, at least in the Tibetan Buddhist world, Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche really ushered in what is the possibility for a Western, at least Western Tantric Buddhism. And, let alone his life and how he lived his life, anything people might have issues with. If you just read his teachings and you engage with his talks and books, they're very profound. and give a lot of advice for us of how to work with this in the West, because he defined the West as speedy, like suffering from speed, aggression, and hypermaterialism, basically.
Yes.
Where and he probably mentioned Puritanism at points, but anyways, when he came, it was like the full on hippie, peace and love movement, right? So he came, those were all his students. So maybe he didn't see so much Puritanism, or maybe I'm sure he did in other elements of society. But anyways, he has so many teachings on this, on more or less like not leaving anything out. And I wanted to go back to something you mentioned too about dance and how we're exploring in Western Buddhism, how to reimagine a holistic path. That's the way I think about it. Because actually in Tibetan Buddhism, I talked about being sedentary. That's just sort of my proclivity or personality. But I think it's also an interpretation of Eastern spirituality that's kind of wrong, Not wrong. It's not wrong. I would just say there's more, right? There's more to it. And what I mean by that is like Tibetan Buddhism has dance, has a lot of ritual. It has, and Zen does too, it has ritual. It has other expressions of art, the sciences. These are all things people study in the monastery. And so, I'm personally, I really appreciate and love Tibetan culture, but I don't really want to learn their, like, the form of, it doesn't resonate with me, like, some of the music forms and things like that, even though I appreciate it. As far as the ritual stuff, I do it as part of, tantric practice, because I've found meaning in it. So I enjoy that. But aside from that, what you're really talking about is how we need to incorporate the body. And I think, I think I'm really interested in seeing what comes out of that, which, as you already said, goes into this realm of how do we dissolve the self-world barrier and not, instead of reaffirming it or re-encouraging that or even contracting it further. I think that's really what it comes down to when we're developing, these new modalities.
Yes, I'm with you. And I want to appreciate you for mentioning Chogyam Trungpa, also a huge inspiration for me over the years. And also, as a female Dharma teacher especially, I think it's important to name, like, as I've spent time even in Zen studying history and the female Buddhas and their stories, it has been clear how much misogyny has threaded through Buddhist history. It has been clear how much patriarchal conditioning has impacted and still does impact today Buddhism. There's so many things I could say about this. I'm not going to go into right now, but I will name that that impacts all of us in our practice, and the stories that we can read about, which are carrying something similar to Puritanism in terms of a hatred of the female body, a hatred of female beauty, as an example, a real fear of Eros, has always felt sticky and confusing to me, given the context of practice. And, this feels, well, something personal I'll share is just that it is my experience, and we're all different. But for me, that when I made a commitment to the path of sacred sexuality and re-embodying Eros, re-honoring, to be very specific, my vagina as being such a sacred aspect of my Dharma practice. My practice took a turn that I never could have expected and deepened in ways I never had foreseen. But I think I had a glimpse of when I read these stories of the female Buddhas, because I sensed, oh my gosh, there's something historically that human consciousness, especially through patriarchy, is terrified of. And it does come through Eros. Just again, we're defining that very broadly, both related to sacred sexuality and life force. but there's something that gets lost profoundly when there's just a turning away from it or trying to turn it into any dogmatic approach.
Yeah. Thanks for raising that up. And I feel like, we can do a whole nother episode on this, a whole nother conversation but I'd like to say something now and see, if we want to explore it more here. It is a can of worms, and I want to be conscious. There's many views on this. It's my view that patriarchy and misogyny, they have been it has been the world. So it's not just Buddhism, it's not just Christianity, it's not just religion, it's not just politics. It has been the world, like a predominant system in the world, systems and ideologies and ways of thinking, and not embodying, we could say, like, sacred feminine, and not respecting women, right? And so I think when we acknowledge it, then it's like there's no area in the world it hasn't touched, including Buddhism, right? So I just see it that way, and that means it's important. I think it's being transformed as we're speaking. This is the era. We're moving into a different era. And in Buddhist and Hindu cosmology, they have this interpretation of yugas, right? Or periods of time where they have certain flavors of how our samsaric karma plays out. I think we're in the Kali Yuga for some more time. And Kali, by the way, is it's a wrathful feminine energy. But I think we're in the Kali Yuga for some more time. But I think, to me, it feels like we're having a major shift here. And like you say, when we look at the broader picture, it's not just about female-bodied or people who identify as female-bodied. It's about all of us, and to me, it's been. God, I got so much to say about this, but it's there's the systems issues and how this affects female-bodied individuals in the world, and there's a whole conversation around that. Obviously, that things need to change as quickly as possible in order to benefit more beings, and to move into to not base any systems off of any kind of inequality. I mean, that's just its own statement and conversation. But because we're talking about Eros and the spiritual field here, and how patriarchy, and I love how you brought it up as kind of an energy, because that's how I see it. And even my own relationship to sexuality, I think I shared this in our last conversation, that I was talking about my mom's death, and my friends brought me to a strip club. Like, that was their, to go drink beer and go to strip club after her funeral. And it was incredibly incongruous for me. There was something like, part of me was just like, this is not the thing to do. This is not the thing to be doing. And at the same time, I was into it because I was like a 16-year-old boy. And anyways, and then, we can go into the field of how there's so much to talk about how both men and women are conditioned, in very unhealthy ways around sexuality, patriarchy, and misogyny. But what I did want to say, kind of relating to some deeper aspects of it, is I feel it's an imbalance that needs to be worked with in ourselves, like individually, and then culturally, and socially. And that imbalance for me, and I'm just love to hear your thoughts on this. So in classical tantra, we have masculine and feminine energy. Those are named, or they're a little bit more. They're named more esoterically. They're not always named explicitly. But in tantric Buddhism, we see masculine energy actually as the skillful means, the kind of, in its beneficial form, the skillful means. It's actually the compassionate or loving energy. It's the energy. It's the action that comes out of compassion. So we see it as action-based energy, where we see the feminine more as the related to shunyata. We see the feminine more as the spacious womb. And so much of what we're naming here is, I think our conversation is circled around that spacious womb for the most part. Of, like, for me, one of my main practices is relating to space, relating to either opening that up or meeting unconditioned space if I can, and trying to train in letting be with that. And to me, because in each of us, we have these energies, they're not they're not bodied. We all have both, no matter even how we identify or any of that. We all have both. And I feel like the enlightened expression of these is when they unify and there's no more duality around them, right? And so I just wanted to share that. It's not coming out exactly in the way it's in my head, but I think you know what I mean. It's sort of like, yeah. I see this as a deeper disconnect of balance of energy within oneself and socially and culturally.
Yes, an imbalance of energy within and within our world. And so, yes, there is the systemic layer of patriarchy, but you're talking more about the much bigger picture and how we are in, the beautiful, messy, and dynamic healing of that now, a rebalancing. And that rebalancing invites everyone, each of us in our practice, into a very deep living inquiry, into the balance of what I would call yin and yang, the receptive and expressive or active aspects of nature and consciousness. You shared beautiful language from Tibetan Buddhism for this balance. And I will say something that's been fascinating for me is I guide a lot of work around this. And I want to emphasize this is work for people of every gender. It's not a feminine, masculine thing. It's a collective thing. And it was so interesting to me. I also do a lot of teaching around teaching a field called regenerative leadership, which is really reconnecting with what some might consider more feminine ways of leading, the rebalancing of the yin and yang in how we lead and facilitate and teach. But it's so interesting because my experience was when I first opened up this field of work for people to come in, many more men beyond women or people of any gender signed up and were like, I need this, because I've become so aware through my Dharma practice of the ways I've been conditioned to only think my value is in the yang, the active, the expressive, productivity, the getting somewhere, the attaining, even as spiritual practice, trying to be the solo heroic spiritual warrior, and recognizing that they were being called to really revalue and re-recognize the strength of the slow, the yin, the fertile emptiness. You use the word womb, that space, the spacious womb, which this is what our practice teaches us. But it's so valuable to look at how it fits into and supports the healing of patriarchal paradigm, which is just held on to one side of the duality rather than the sacred integration of both.
Yeah.
So really rich. Really rich.
Yeah. I think we should continue with this conversation around this, because it this begs a whole nother question, which again, this could be just some questions for next time too, if you want, unless you want to say something of like, I don't know, I'm getting more and more suspicious of putting energy into, we need system change. So I'll just say that straight out, changing things when we make changes on the level of law and representation and leadership, those have big waves. So I just want to say I'm big fans of those processes, And I'm getting more and more suspicious of when there's too much energy being put into outer shift as opposed to the inner work, And I think there's a lot of us recognizing this right now,
Yes. This is why I wrote my last book, Luminous Darkness, about the rebalancing of light and dark, because it's not enough to simply work on the systems we have to address. We have to address the seed from which those imbalances get perpetuated, that impact all of these come from this seed of this fundamental duality. And then right now I'm guiding a course on sacred activism, and so many people are hungry for the invitation to celebrate the merging between the inner work and the state of our world in a way that this conversation is pointing to. Just an aside, Scott, you and I have been holding the inquiry of what is something we'd like to co-teach about together next year. And it could be about this, the yin and yang sacred feminine, sacred masculine, rebalancing. Such a rich topic. So
I would love that. Yeah. Yeah. I'm in.
right.
Yeah. I think that's great. Yeah. Cause as we can see, like we've already gone beyond an hour, and, I feel like we just barely touched the surface, because, we didn't, there's also this whole realm of how to access what we're talking about. I mean, you described a little bit, you gave some practical things for folks, but I think there's so much more of how to access these things. And, there's, and a lot of that, it's just so experiential, where the theory is for me, I've relied on analytical thinking mind most of my life, because that's what's prized. That's how we're taught in modern education. And that is part of the imbalance for me of it's a masculine tool that's helpful, but it becomes harmful when it becomes overemphasized, and we're not able to let be, as you said, in the space, within the space of something, within the time that something allows, right? Like not pushing.
Yeah.
And so for me, this has been a wound I've been trying to heal for many years. And yeah, I've definitely come to think of it as like relating to those feminine energies within me more and more, and in the broadest sense of what that means, right?
Yes, absolutely. And there's something, we've touched again and again in this call just about the healing of the body-spirit divide, the sex-spirit divide. But anyone who has a deep practice and who wants to continually go deeper, it's very, very useful to recognize the ways that we may have been conditioned, as you're saying, to overvalue the rational mind or more linear forms of knowing, and to recognize the right place for that, while also no longer avoiding the innate wisdom of our bodies, which, of course, everything about our meditation practice puts us back in touch with, but that some of us have even more work to do around that, because this is a time when, one way I would put it is that our capacity to listen deeply, to be receptive, and to really be awake to our relationship with the natural world is vitally important. And so Eros, erotic intelligence, can guide us not only in the path of letting sacred sexuality and our most intimate relationships be about waking up through that portal, but also about reminding us of our innate capacity to connect with the trees we walk by, with the earth in a more palpable, potent way. It's just a time when there's not anything that is useful anymore for human consciousness to both serve egocentricity and anthropocentricity. And I think Eros is a very important ally. Yeah,
I agree. Yeah, I think that's a wonderful place to close too for today, because I couldn't agree more. I don't have any more. I have more to say about it, but I think just you said it. Yeah, that was beautiful, perfect. Eden, thank you so much. As always, I feel like we end on a high note, and with a lot more questions and a lot more to explore. And yeah, definitely, I think we have a nice topic for a retreat we can co-teach. So
absolutely, thank you so much, Scott, and thank you for those who are listening.
Yeah, thanks so much.